For more on this story, I'm joined by Farida Deif. She is the Canada Director of Human Rights Watch, and she is in Toronto this hour. Thank you, Farida, for joining us.
Thank you.
So these will be the second and third adults who have been repatriated so far. Well, we'll see if they're repatriated, but they've been allowed to leave Syria. What do you make of this?
Well, I think you see sort of globally a push to repatriate. More and more governments are recognizing that the situation on the ground is untenable, that they shouldn't abandon their nationals to unlawful, arbitrary detention indefinitely. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled on this case, which is why you see several European countries repatriating their nationals. The French repatriated about 40 children last week and 15 French women. You see a push by a number of governments to take action. The Australia's new prime minister is also committed to take action to repatriate Australian nationals from these squalid camps and prisons. The Canadian government's approach is unfortunately a very case-by-case situation where there's only been a handful of repatriations to date, even though Canada only has about 40 Canadian nationals in those camps. And so an entirely manageable number, all of whom should be repatriated, rehabilitated, reintegrated, and anyone who may have committed crimes can be prosecuted for those crimes here in Canada.
Are there national security concerns here, though? These women did leave to join ISIS. Is there a risk in bringing them back?
There's a far greater national security risk in leaving Canadian nationals in these squalid camps. There's a risk of radicalization. There's a risk of escaping from those camps. It's a far better situation to have an orderly return and repatriation to Canada. Any type of monitoring, judicial process can happen here. We, of course, have a robust judicial system, robust law enforcement. So from a national security perspective, returning these Canadians in an orderly fashion is far better than leaving them in these squalid camps and prisons for further radicalization. And what we saw just in January was that ISIS affiliates actually broke into a male prison. So there you have a scenario where there's really heightened security risks and risks of escape versus an orderly transition back to Canada and reintegration, rehabilitation, and any prosecution for anyone that may have committed crimes.
Is that what you expect to happen sooner rather than later?
The Canadian government has a new policy framework that they put in place for extraordinary assistance, which basically creates a kind of case-by-case scenario where Global Affairs will review each individual case and determine whether or not to provide what they call extraordinary assistance to these Canadians. And so there's very few criteria that need to be met in order to allow for these repatriations. So these individuals either have to have serious health concerns, that children have to be unaccompanied, or their conditions have really changed since the implementation of this policy. And so this policy framework was really put in place in order for the government to sort of close the door on repatriation, to really limit the number of repatriations and to allow the government to treat this file in a sort of piecemeal fashion, a case-by-case basis, rather than a policy framework that is really recognizes that no Canadian should spend even one day in arbitrary detention, and that all of these individuals should be repatriated. Unfortunately, what we see is more of a piecemeal approach rather than really a sustainable policy that ensures that all of those Canadians who remain in these squalid camps in disastrous health conditions in a real insecure environment are repatriated and brought home.
And what do we know about what happens to Canadians, just quickly, who have been repatriated once they return?
Well, there's only been 2 Canadian children that have been repatriated and 1 adult woman who was, I would say, reluctantly repatriated by the government following a lawsuit. We know that in terms of the adults, so the only 1 adult that's been repatriated, there's been some monitoring of her by the RCMP, by CSIS. We're not sure what's going to happen next in terms of a judicial process, but that's been the kind of one case of an adult Canadian that we know of.
Farida, I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's Farida Deif, the Director of Human Rights Watch Canada.